The history of x86. Next slide. Now, the history of x86 begins with the original 8080 8-bit microprocessor that Intel introduced in 1974. From there, the chip expanded to support 16 bits and was called the 8086 processor in 1978. From there, the processor was expanded even further to be able to process 32 bits at a time, or what we would call 4 bytes, in 1985, and this was called the 8386 processor. That was then finally expanded to the 64-bit processor introduced in 2003 and 2004. One of the very interesting and unique things about x86 as an architecture is that backwards compatibility has been a fundamental key from the beginning. Every generation of the chips I just spoke about introduced new functionality but didn't remove or break any old functionality. So that means that code that runs on the original 8086 processor can actually run unmodified on the latest 9th generation architecture. So your modern processor that's in your computer right now could run that original code from the 1970s. This has some very interesting side effects. One of them is that 8086 has become an immense, complicated, but very interesting architecture. What you're seeing now is the silicon die of an x86 processor. If you were to take a processor from inside of your computer, remove all of the plastic housing around it, what you'd see is the silicon die with millions upon millions of these tiny transistors and buses and tiny little pieces of circuitry. And it's fascinating how complicated something like your processor really is. Speaking of complicated, Intel develops a software developer's manual that they publish online. It's free to download. If you go to download that manual, forewarning that it's over 4,000 pages long. It doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of the nuances of the Intel x86 architecture. Our goal in this training is to give you the basics. But I want to say that the basics doesn't mean that you're going to walk away not really knowing any x86. What you will find is of that 4,000 page developer manual, if your goal is to be able to understand, read, and write most x86, what you need is about 0.01% of that developer's manual. The nuances of how the processor works under the hood, how the transistors work, how some of the fuses work, really isn't relevant to most people who are trying to learn x86. So while this training is technically just giving you the basics, it is giving you everything you need to write, debug, and read x86 programs. Now, the term x86 itself generally refers to all architectures based off of the original 8086 architecture. That means the 8086 16-bit, the 8286 32-bit, and the 8886 64-bit version of the architecture are all collectively referred to as x86. Now, you'll sometimes see the term x64 or x86_64, which specifically refers to the 64-bit version of x86. In this training in particular, we're going to concentrate on the 32-bit version of x86, and that's because it's still the most prevalent right now. But also understand that there's backwards compatibility with all of the architectures, meaning that everything you learn in the 32-bit version of x86 directly translates to the 64-bit version. It's simply the data is larger, the registers are larger.